Hello and welcome, I'm another Magento dev, and today we're going to be looking at installing Magento 2.4.1 using Composer and exposing, if you like, some of the pitfalls, quite a few pitfalls that Magento have laid in our path for this type of install. We've got rid of the wizard for one. Two, Elasticsearch is now mandatory on your system, and we're going to be using a MacBook Pro. I see a lot of videos out there where they've got a fancy Ubuntu setup and everything seems to run smoothly, but not on a Mac. Let's jump in and take a look. Alright then, so we're going to install a Magento, and I'm going to make some mistakes. I'm going to trip over the normal landmines, what majority of people hit when installing Magento 2.1. You know, stuff doesn't go to plan often. So I've created a folder here in VS Code I'm using, but use the ID of your choice. So yeah, away we go in VS Code in a folder called M241. Now if you look at Magento docs, recommends installing Magento using Composer. I always install the Magento version from the repository using Composer. I don't bother with never really bothered with the Git version, but I'm sure there'll be videos out there for Git, the install from the Git. But I'm going with Composer because it's nice and simple. And then you've got Composer. You know, it gets you into the habit of using Composer for module installs and plugins and general management upgrades of your Magento store going forward. It's handy to be handy with Composer. So, particularly where Magento is concerned. Now, it says here that this is all you need to do, right? And for all intents and purposes, it does. It is, sorry. So, what we'll do is, we'll jump into command line here, and we'll paste this in. Now, because I'm in the folder that I'm installing Magento into, just need to bang a dot on the end there. If I was to call this something like Magento or whatever, it would create a folder within this folder, which I don't want to do. I want to, install it in this folder. Now this is going to crash. This is going to error. It always errors for me. I've got a decent MacBook, but this always errors, and we'll go through why in a sec. So as you can see, it's added Composer JSON, and it's going to try and install Magento. And most of the time, if you ran this on a web server in a blank directory, you're not going to have a problem. But on my MacBook, which is a good one, as I say, I always get this, and I don't think it's anything really to do with the MacBook itself. It is down to the PHP settings on the version of PHP I'm using, which is PHP which is a MAMP version of 7.3. Now, I have been in and edited the settings for memory limit and things like that, and I've given it a good old welly on there, of a few gig, but this Composer install never seems to like it, and a few other commands on Magento sometimes hit this error. Now the one with Composer, I find it's a little bit more complicated because it doesn't feel as if you're accessing PHP when you're doing it, but in actual fact you are. The Composer command at the beginning, this is almost like a little symlink to a file basically called composer.phar, composer phar, .phar. So you are able to inject a preferred memory limit into this. So a little workaround for Mac users and anyone else who struggles with editing PHP ini files or just doesn't fancy doing it, which I don't, because it leads to other issues down the line usually when you faff with anything like that. So I don't bother. But what I do is, first of all, you got to find out where Composer is. Right? You got to find the path to Composer, and that's quite simple. You just say which Composer, and it tells you where it is. It gives you the file path here, right? So with that, you can then use PHP, like if you was running, for actual Magento users who've done this type of thing before. When you're actually updating Magento or using bin Magento commands, it's generally you'd prefix it with PHP at the beginning, and PHP is basically just saying access. Same again. Look, on my system, it's which PHP. It's basically a symlink to this alias that I've got of PHP 7.3 in my ZSH file. That's it, simple. So if I say PHP and then I use this version of this composer here, well actually in between I want to say dmemory underscore limit, so I want to like directly tell PHP to override whatever's in the settings and give it 8 gig. Give it more than what you need. I mean, I'm not going to work out the bytes of this, but you know, it looks like a couple of gig or whatever, 1.5 gig. But here I'm going to say, look, 8 gig, it should be more than enough. You can actually do this, right? -1. You've probably seen that in other applications. You know, you can do that in sort of WordPress for getting posts. You know, for example, to get every post in WordPress. -1 in PHP is basically everything, right? Just don't stop. But I don't fancy doing that either, because if there is a major issue, then I do want my MacBook to stop doing what it's doing, because obviously the knock-on effects of that could be severe. Right, so I'm going to go for 8 gig, and I'm going to say access that file there, which I said it is essentially a PHP file, but it's PHAR. And then I'm going to, at this point, this is the point where I am at here, right? So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to bang this in again, and the eagle-eyed monster is going to notice that this isn't going to work either, and this isn't going to work because I've already had an attempt, and this trips a lot of people up. It's tripped me up numerous occasions. I've already had an attempt and Composer's in there, right? It won't install Magento if there's something in the folder, right? So I've just got to get rid of that before I retry, and it's only going to whack that file back in, and you know, pressing up on your keyboard is just a nice quick way of getting that back. Okay, right then, that's all installed, as you can see here. It's installed the full package from the official Magento repository. So just a quick note on that, if you're doing this for the first time, so if you've never done this before, it's important to note that you will need a Magento account to do it this way. So you'd need to, because you need access keys, and the way you get those, and this is often a stumbling block, because I'll say to developers, my developers, just install as Magento, and because they don't do it that often, they forget where the keys are. Now, you would think to just log into your Magento account, which is at magento.com, but it's not quite there. I mean, there's a couple of extra clicks basically, and one of the clicks takes you to a brand new website. It doesn't keep you on magento.com, so it can be a bit slow, and sometimes you have to re-log in and find the profile. So essentially, if you go direct to that link there, marketplace.magento.co.uk/customer account, your access keys are found in there. This is all within the same Magento account, so I won't go to it, so I don't have to edit out my keys. But essentially, what you're asked for on command line, if you're doing it for the first time, is a username, which is the first access key, and then a password, which is the second access key. So essentially, once you've put them in, it'll ask you if you want to save them for future use on your system, which you can do, and then everything goes a little bit smoother in future. But I thought I'd just note that, because it's it's one of them things that people forget about. Right, so yeah, as you can see, this is my Composer that it's now put in there. It's now installed via. You've got your vendor folder, which is where Magento lives basically, and all the other folders that are used to be able to support and run the platform. So just a quick note, obviously this is installing a fresh Magento using Composer, but the principle is fairly similar if you're obviously if you're working on someone else's Magento. So say you're part of a team and you're working on a site and you're downloading it from Bitbucket. Well, this wouldn't be in your Git repo on Bitbucket or GitHub. The vendor folder would be empty usually, and should be, along with some other files and folders that shouldn't be there for security reasons. But what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to install any Magento using this method. So essentially, this folder being empty is not a problem. You run Composer install from here, and it goes to the repository, and it essentially fills this folder. So it puts all the dependencies in there and everything. And because the Composer that you get from the repository should be the same as the person that you're getting it from, and then you'll end up with the same configuration in the same system and the same vendor folder. So it's pretty handy using Composer and getting used to Composer. So I thought I'd just mention that. Right, so once we're in this situation here, where we've got everything installed. Now we have to actually set up, because we're doing this for the first time, we now have to actually set up Magento. And the key thing to note here, well, there's a couple of things, is the etc folder, or the etc folder, however you want to pronounce it. I think Magento people actually pronounce it on the tutorials, pronounce it Etsy, which is pretty cool, but I'm not going to be cool. I'm going to be me, and I'm going to say etc. So the etc folder is lacking a couple of very important files, right? And these files are generated by the installation. So it's similar in a WordPress, where if you've ever installed a WordPress, you don't get a WP config, you get a sample. And by running the installer, it creates the config because it connects it to the database, etc. But as I mentioned at the beginning, Magento have removed our wizard, so we haven't got one. So we're going to have to do this on command line. Right, now we're going to configure our system, and I use MAMP Pro. And for $70 or whatever it is, I think it's $69. It's well worth it. It's so worth it. I tried using Valet Plus and even I use just the free version of MAMP for years, which it's possible to use the free version. You just don't get all the nice interface. You don't get the ability to check all the different and use all these different services. It's got PHP debug built into it. It's really just a lovely interface to be able to use and manage your local sites. And the best thing about it is it provides SSL support out the box. It's just really good. It's really good, and you can interact with databases, using all the different tools, and it manages the ports that they're all on, and it's just really good to use. So I'm gonna show you how to set up a Magento compatible instance using MAMP Pro. But you can actually do it, as I say, using, if you're a user of free MAMP, you'll already know the differences. You'll be able to set this up. So essentially, you need a site. You need an actual site. So I'm going to call this one m241.local. You can use anything on MAMP Pro. It's pretty good, and generate an SSL certificate. But I'm also going to choose my directory, which is m2.4.1, and then create that host. It's created me a little secure certificate as well. I'm going to run it on Apache. I'm going to run it on 7.4.9, but obviously you can choose the version, switch out pretty easy. The other important thing to set up is a database that you're going to install into. So similar to WordPress, you start with a blank database, put in the details, brings it all to life from the install. Magento does the same thing, but except it's just via command line, as I've mentioned. So I'm going to also call this m241. I'm going to grant access to my root user, which people using the free version, that's already pretty much the case. So it's just root and root. I don't generally deviate from those credentials working locally. It's pretty straightforward that way. So this has essentially created me a database and a site all linked together. So I'm all set up. Just need to save it, and it's going to restart my servers for me. Okay, so now we're back on command line, and I'm going to try and run an install. Okay, so I'm going to run PHP, the Magento setup install, and then you need to put in some parameters. And now most of these are pretty important, so I'm gonna pretty much use them all. Maybe apart from time zone and language, you can go back in and reset those. So those three there are probably the least important. We don't really need those to run at this point. You know, if you're struggling to think, well, what do I actually put there? You know, is it London/Dublin or European, whatever it, you know, they have particular things. If you know these things, you know, if you're installing it for an English-based site, you want ENGB in there, but you can pretty much throw it up and then change those things in config. You know, it just basically anything that overcomplicates this process is probably not worth it. So essentially, I know that my file path is HTTPS, and then it was m241.local. So this was my URL, and then also note that you don't have to have the / in front of it, which Magento will do that. If people who are familiar with Magento know that that's a pretty important thing in the database. Also, another thing, I've had apprentices copying and pasting. You know, they'll save this full string, for example, on their notepad, when they copy it back in, these two little guys go to a single one, right? And then the whole thing don't work. So I always say, when you're installing it, take the time to type it out and type it out properly. Don't copy and paste this. It's not worth it. You can copy and paste the components like I'm doing here, because they copy and paste over from Magento. Just on a Mac, sometimes this goes to it, and you don't notice it. You just don't notice it, and they're like, oh, what's happened? My install hasn't worked again. Whinging. Right, so these are obviously fairly important. As you can see, this is for database name. Or obviously, I'm working locally, so localhost. But if you was installing Magento on another server, or if you, for whatever reason, don't use localhost, and you're connecting to a database on a different IP address or something, you'd replace. But predominantly localhost if you're using MAMP or Valet or whatever. Valet actually might be 1.2. You might have to specify the port, the IP 127.0.0.1. So, but localhost should work. It's the same thing. So database name was M241, and then database. So DB hyphen user was next equals, and it was root for me. Obviously, this is just set up with some defaults, and then this one, for some reason, people always forget this. Password, very important. Root again for me locally. Admin first name. So you'd wanna replace this because it's asking for your human name and your last name, and just sort of go through the process step by step, paying attention to what I'm putting in. I'm going to show you this in its full form. I'm not going to skip it because I think it's pretty important. Actually, I will leave that. It can be pretty much any email address. I won't put in my real one. Right. So that's the admin. That's the admin details. These are probably the most important. So you remember which username and password you've set it up for. So it's admin user admin. Probably want to be a bit more creative than that for security purposes, but because this is on my local host, don't really matter. This one. So if you don't set this, so a little pitfall, you'll set up your site, you'll start working on it, and you'll wonder why index.php is in your URLs. Well, it's because you haven't set this to 1 when you've installed it, and you'd have to go back into the settings and change it, so you might as well just do it here. Right, and this is probably going to fail for me, and I'll come on to why in a second. Let's run it. So this is what you'd expect to see. See, it's added now my env file, which I'll show you again in a second. It's now installing the database into my empty database. It's added a config file as well, which is really important, which I might do a separate video on these two files and explain them in a bit more detail, because understanding those two files is pretty important in Magento, and understanding what they're doing, particularly if you're working in teams and you're working with the config file. Look, there we go. So this is a little treat that Magento have decided to force upon us, and no doubt it's for a good reason. It now not only recommends using Elasticsearch, but from 2.4.0 it's mandatory, right? So you've got to have it installed. Now I'll probably do a separate video on how to install it, but if you have got it installed, you've essentially just got to have it running. So what I generally do is I don't want it running on my system all the time, Elasticsearch, because I've heard that it can affect the performance of your Mac or your actual system. So what I'm going to do is, I know that I have actually got it installed, so if I just run Elasticsearch and just spin up a version of it, and I just sort of leave it running in the background, depending on which, you get all this garb here, just leave it running in the background when I'm developing on a 2.4.1. Essentially the site will run with it, but you can't run any of the database in upgrade scripts or anything like that. So people hit this error, right? So this is an important thing. Got to get Elasticsearch installed. As I say, I'll do another video, but we'll try this again. Now Elasticsearch is running, and it'll run through its. It'll do its stuff again. See, if you're installing a 2.3.5, you don't have any of this to worry about. Or and you get a little wizard as well. But you know they've done this for 2.4 and 2.4.1. So nice one. Nice one, Magento. Here we go. Right, and so it's getting fair there. You can see it's adding all the modules now. It's linking them up. Brilliant. So we're done, and it's giving my admin URL here as well, which is important information that we need to sort of remember. However, you know, if you forget it, little tip, ding, it's there as well. So it's saved it into your env, and so this is what it's just generated, similar to WP config or whatever. You've got downloadable domains is a new thing, so that's for cause, which again probably need another video on. But essentially, we're installed, right? And now we're 2.4.1. Now that's taken a while. Okay. So the config file that's created is important as well. So these are all Magento's default modules that are in there. You can do a lot with this file. As I say, I want to do another video sort of with a bit more of an understanding of what this is actually doing. But if you start adding new modules and things like that, and you add them locally in a code folder, which doesn't exist by default, but you can create it and then start creating your modules, this is where you would control whether they're on or off within the actual install itself. But there we go, we're up and running.